On a crystalline December morning in 1950, high above the frozen Yalu River, Captain James Jabara spotted them, a formation of silver shapes gleaming against the blue sky. MiG-15s, Soviet-designed swept-wing fighters that could outclimb, outturn, and outgun anything the Americans had flown before. Jabara pushed his F-86 Sabre into a diving attack. The jets screamed toward each other at a combined speed of over 1,200 miles per hour. In seconds, they merged in a twisting, turning knife fight at 30,000 feet. Contrails traced impossible geometries across the sky. Cannon fire stitched the air, and when it was over, a MiG tumbled earthward, trailing smoke. Welcome to MiG Alley, a stretch of North Korean sky that became the proving ground for jet combat, where American and Soviet-built fighters clashed in the world's first jet versus jet war, where pilots who'd learned their trade in propeller-driven Mustangs and Corsairs now fought at speeds their fathers could barely imagine, where the future of air combat was being written in contrails and cannon fire. This is the story of the men who fought in those crystalline skies and the machines that carried them into battle. When the Korean War began in June 1950, American air power seemed overwhelming. The United States Air Force had squadrons of F-80 Shooting Stars, America's first operational jet fighter. The Navy had jets beginning to operate from carriers. The North Koreans had propeller-driven aircraft left over from World War II, flown by poorly trained pilots. It was a mismatch. American pilots shot down North Korean aircraft almost at will. Air superiority was established within weeks. Ground attack missions proceeded with impunity. The sky belonged to the United Nations forces. And then, in November 1950, everything changed. As UN forces pushed toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Communist China, American pilots began reporting something new. Swept-wing jets, silver and fast, emerging from Manchurian airspace. They came in formations, attacked aggressively, then disappeared back across the Yalu before American fighters could engage. These were MiG-15s, and they represented a quantum leap in jet fighter design. The MiG-15 was born from captured German research at the end of World War II. Soviet engineers had studied German swept-wing designs and combined them with a powerful engine, ironically based on a British design the UK had sold to the Soviets. The result was a fighter that could climb to 50,000 feet, could turn tightly at high altitude, and mounted cannons powerful enough to destroy a bomber with a single burst. American F-80 Shooting Stars, straight-winged jets designed in the 1940s, were hopelessly outmatched. The MiG could fly higher, faster, and could outturn the F-80 at altitude. Worse, the MiGs seemed to be flown by pilots who knew what they were doing. The first MiG kill came on November 8, 1950, when Lieutenant Russell Brown, flying an F-80, managed to position himself behind a MiG and shoot it down. But it was an exception. The MiG-15 was proving to be a game-changer, and the Air Force knew it. Fortunately, America had an answer, one that was just arriving in theater. The F-86 Sabre was North American aviation's response to the jet age. Like the MiG, it featured swept wings, 35 degrees of sweep that allowed it to approach the speed of sound in a dive. It was armed with 650 caliber machine guns, less powerful than the MiG's cannons, but with a higher rate of fire and more ammunition. It had a radar-ranging gun sight that could compute the proper lead for deflection shots, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was one of the most beautiful flying machines ever built. The first F-86 arrived in Korea in December 1950. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, veterans who'd flown Mustangs in World War II, transitioned to the Sabre in record time. They needed to. The MiGs were getting bolder. The stretch of airspace where most of the jet combat occurred became known as MiG Alley. It was roughly roughly 100 miles of North Korean territory south of the Yalu River, between the Yellow Sea and the mountains of the interior. The MiGs would sweep down from their bases in Manchuria, bases that were off-limits to UN attack due to political constraints, engage American fighters, and then retreat across the border. The rules of engagement were maddeningly restrictive. American pilots could not cross the Yalu River. They could not attack MiGs on the ground in China. They had to wait for the enemy to come to them and fight on terms partly dictated by geography and politics. But when the fight came, it was unlike anything the world had seen before. Jet combat at 40,000 feet bears little resemblance to the dogfights of World War II. There are no slow, turning battles where you can watch your opponent maneuver. Everything happens at speeds that compress decisions into fractions of seconds. A typical mission into MiG Alley began before dawn. Pilots would gather for briefing, weather, intelligence, radio frequencies, the location of rescue helicopters in case someone went down. Then the walk to the flight line, where crew chiefs had the Sabres ready, engines warmed up, fuel tanks full. The takeoff from bases like Kimpo or Suwon was routine. 4-ship flights, 2 elements of 2 aircraft each, climbing in formation toward the northwest. As they climbed through 30,000 feet, the world below became abstract, a geography of rivers and mountains rendered in shades of brown and gray. The real war was up here, in the thin, cold air where your breath frosted the inside of your canopy and your pressurized suit squeezed your body like a fist every time you pulled G-forces in a turn. Radar controllers on the ground, call sign dentist, would vector the Sabres toward contacts. Bandits, north of you, 15 miles, Angels 40. Angels meant thousands of feet of altitude. 40 meant 40,000 feet, near the operational ceiling of both aircraft. And then you'd see them, silver glints against the sky. MiG-15s in formation, sometimes 4, sometimes 16, wheeling in the distance like a school of deadly fish. The merge was the critical moment. 2 formations of jets hurtling toward each other at a combined speed of 1,200 miles per hour or more. In the seconds before merge, a pilot had to assess altitude advantage, sun position, speed, formation integrity. Then it was into the turn. Jet combat was 3-dimensional chess played at supersonic speeds. Altitude was life. The pilot with more altitude could dive to gain speed, could choose when and where to engage. But altitude alone wasn't enough. You needed speed and you needed position. The F-86 and MiG-15 were roughly equal in performance, each with advantages. The MiG could climb faster and had a slightly better turn rate at high altitude. Its cannons, 223mm and 137mm, could destroy an aircraft with a single burst. But the F-86 was more stable as a gun platform, had better visibility from the cockpit, and was easier to control at high speed. American pilots also had better training, especially in deflection shooting, the art of firing ahead of a target so that your bullets and the enemy aircraft arrived at the same point in space at the same moment. Captain James Jabara understood this better than most. By May 1951, he'd become the world's first jet ace, with 5 MiG kills. His 6th kill came on May 20th, in a sprawling dogfight that ranged across 50 miles of sky. Jabara had spotted a formation of MiGs below him. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S, a diving attack that traded altitude for speed. The MiGs saw him coming and turned to meet him. What followed was a turning fight at 20,000 feet, both aircraft pulling maximum G-forces, contrails spiraling from their wingtips as they bled off speed and energy. Jabara got inside the MiG's turn, just barely. He fired a burst, saw his tracers walking toward the enemy fighter. The MiG's canopy shattered, smoke poured from its engine. The pilot ejected, and Jabara watched the parachute blossom as the MiG spiraled into the hills below. But these victories came at a cost. The MiG pilots were getting better, and there were disturbing reports from the debriefings. American intelligence knew that most of the MiG-15s flying from Manchurian bases bore North Korean or Chinese markings, but the pilots inside those cockpits were another matter entirely. Some MiG pilots flew with a skill that suggested far more than the few months of training Chinese or North Korean pilots could have received. They used tactics that were sophisticated, disciplined, radio calls that, when intercepted, were sometimes in Russian. The uncomfortable truth was that many of the MiGs were flown by Soviet pilots, experienced veterans of World War II, flying under strict orders to maintain radio silence in Russian and to avoid capture at all costs. If shot down over UN-controlled territory, they were to deny their Soviet identity. Stalin wanted to test his aircraft and his pilots against the Americans, but he wanted plausible deniability. The presence of Soviet pilots was an open secret, discussed in classified briefings but never publicly acknowledged. It added a layer of Cold War tension to every engagement. American and Soviet pilots were killing each other over Korea, even as their governments maintained the fiction that the Soviet Union was not directly involved in the war. The Soviet regiments operating from bases in Manchuria were among the best the Red Air Force had. They flew in tight formations, used disciplined tactics, and showed none of the hesitation of inexperienced pilots. When these Soviet-flown MiGs engaged American Sabres, the fights were vicious and evenly matched. Captain Joseph McConnell Jr. became one of the top American aces facing these skilled adversaries. McConnell was methodical, patient, a navigator who'd transitioned to fighters and brought a mathematician's precision to the chaos of jet combat. He studied gun camera footage obsessively, looking for patterns in MiG tactics, for the split-second mistakes that would give him an advantage. By early 1953, McConnell had 15 kills, more than any other pilot in the Korean War, but he knew that survival in MiG Alley required more than skill. It required discipline, situational awareness, and a bit of luck. The close calls were numerous. Pilots who ran out of ammunition in the middle of a fight and had to flee for their lives. Pilots who took damage and nursed crippled aircraft back across the lines. Pilots who ejected over enemy territory and spent years in POW camps or were never heard from again. Major George Davis Jr. was one of the best. By February 1952, he had 13 kills. On February 10th, he led his flight into MiG Alley and spotted a large formation of enemy fighters preparing to attack American fighter bombers below. Davis dove to intercept, shot down 2 MiGs, and was lining up on a third when his Sabre was hit by cannon fire. He managed to shoot down the third MiG before his aircraft became uncontrollable. Davis crashed in North Korea and was killed. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The air war was not just about individual duels. It was about protecting the vulnerable. Fighter bombers and bombers, aircraft loaded with bombs and rockets, were easy prey for MiGs if they caught them without escort. The Sabre pilot's primary mission was not to rack up kills, but to keep those attack aircraft safe so they could do their job. While jet fighters dueled at 40,000 feet, another air war was being fought at lower altitudes, a grinding campaign of interdiction against North Korean supply lines, bridges, and marshalling yards. B-29 super fortresses, the same bombers that had laid waste to Japanese cities in World War II, flew missions against North Korean targets. But the B-29 was a propeller-driven aircraft, slow and vulnerable. When MiGs found them, the results were often catastrophic. In October 1951, a formation of 9 B-29s attacked the airfield at Namzi, escorted by dozens of fighters. MiGs swarmed the formation. In the savage fight that followed, 3 B-29s were shot down, and 5 others were damaged so badly they barely made it back to base. The lesson was clear. Daylight bombing against heavily defended targets was suicidal. The Air Force shifted to night bombing and focused fighter escorts in areas where MiGs were most active. But the vulnerability of the bombers remained a constant concern and drove the Sabre pilots to be ever more aggressive in challenging the MiGs before they could reach the bombers. Fighter-bomber missions were equally dangerous. F-86 F-84 Thunderjets and Navy and Marine Corps aircraft, F-9F Panthers, AD Sky Raiders, Corsairs, flew low-altitude attack missions against bridges, supply depots, and troop concentrations. These aircraft were sitting ducks if MiGs caught them with bombs still attached. The task of the Sabre pilots was to create a protective umbrella to keep the MiGs busy or drive them away before they could dive on the attack aircraft. It required coordination, discipline, and a willingness to take on multiple enemies at once if necessary. And it wasn't just about air-to-air combat. Rescue operations became critical. When a pilot went down behind enemy lines, helicopters would attempt rescue, often under fire. Sabre pilots would fly cover, strafing enemy positions, drawing fire away from the vulnerable helicopters. One of the most dramatic rescues occurred in March 1953. Captain Joseph McConnell was shot down after scoring his 15th kill. He ejected over enemy territory, and a rescue helicopter was immediately dispatched. While the helicopter hovered, extracting McConnell under fire, his wingmen circled overhead, engaging enemy ground forces and driving off MiGs that attempted to interfere. McConnell made it out and was flying combat missions again within days. The statistics of the air war tell a story of American dominance, but they don't capture the individual terror and courage. The official kill ratio was roughly 10-1 in favor of the F-86, 792 MiGs claimed shot down versus 78 Sabres lost in air-to-air combat. But those numbers have been disputed. Soviet records released after the Cold War suggest their losses were lower and American losses were higher than claimed. What's undisputed is that both sides produced genuine aces, that the combat was fierce, and that survival required skill, discipline, and luck in equal measure. While the Air Force fought in MiG Alley, another air war was being waged from the decks of aircraft carriers offshore. The Navy and Marine Corps flew thousands of sorties from carriers operating in the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan, missions that were just as dangerous but received far less attention. Carrier operations in Korea were brutal. Pilots launched from pitching decks in all weather, flew missions over mountainous terrain where an engine failure meant ejection or death, and then returned to land on a moving platform that was often shrouded in fog or tossed by heavy seas. The Navy's jets, F-9F Panthers primarily, were subsonic and couldn't compete with MiG-15s in a turning fight. But Navy pilots learned to use hit-and-run tactics to avoid prolonged engagements and to rely on their wingmen for mutual support. Lieutenant Guy Bourdillon became the Navy's only ace of the war, flying a propeller-driven F-4U Corsair on night intruder missions. He shot down 5 enemy aircraft, all at night, using nothing but his eyes and his aircraft's guns. It was a throwback to a different kind of warfare, but it was effective. The Marines, flying from carriers and from rough airstrips in Korea, specialized in close air support. Marine pilots worked directly with ground controllers, often Marine officers on the ground with the infantry. When Marines were pinned down, when Chinese forces were overrunning positions, it was Marine aircraft that came screaming in low, dropping napalm and high explosives dangerously close to friendly positions. The coordination was remarkable. A Marine forward air controller would call in a strike. Enemy in the tree line, 200 yards north of our position. Minutes later, a flight of Corsairs or Sky Raiders would arrive, make a pass to identify the target, and then roll in, dropping ordnance within yards of friendly troops. It was dangerous work. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, and the North Koreans and Chinese became adept at hiding AA guns near likely targets. Dozens of Navy and Marine pilots were shot down on these missions, either killed instantly or captured and sent to POW camps in North Korea. One of the most harrowing aspects of carrier operations was landing at night or in bad weather. The technology of the era was primitive by modern standards. No GPS, no precision approach radar, just a radio beacon, a few lights on the carrier deck, and the landing signal officer waving paddles to guide pilots aboard. Pilots described night carrier landings as controlled controlled crashes. You came in at 120 knots, watching the LSO's signals, trying to maintain altitude and line up while the deck pitched and rolled beneath you. You caught the wire, one of several cables stretched across the deck, or you didn't. If you missed all the wires, you pushed the throttle to full power and tried to get airborne again before you ran out of deck and plunged into the black ocean. Many didn't make it. The Navy lost dozens of aircraft and pilots to operational accidents, running out of fuel before finding the carrier in bad weather, missing the wires and going into the sea, suffering mechanical failures on launch or recovery. Yet the carrier strikes continued throughout the war. Navy and Marine aviators hit bridges, railroads, supply dumps, and enemy positions in a grinding campaign of interdiction that was less glamorous than the jet combat in MiG Alley, but just as critical to the war effort. As the war dragged on through 1952 and into 1953, tactics evolved. Both sides learned from their mistakes and adapted. American pilots developed the Fluid 4 formation, two pairs of fighters that could split and maneuver independently while maintaining mutual support. They learned to fight in the vertical plane, diving and climbing rather than just turning, to better use the F-86's strengths. The MiG pilots, whether Soviet, Chinese, or North Korean, became more aggressive. They began escorting their own fighter bombers on raids into South Korea. They flew at lower altitudes where the MiG's advantages were reduced, but where they could more easily catch American attack aircraft. The introduction of better radar and ground-controlled intercept techniques on both sides made the sky more dangerous. Surprise attacks became more common. Pilots learned to constantly scan the sky, to trust their wingmen, to never fixate on a single target while other threats were nearby. The technological competition continued. The F-86F model, introduced in late 1952, had a more powerful engine and improved controls. It could fight the MiG-15 on more equal terms at all altitudes. American pilots also benefited from better training. Many were World War II veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and situational awareness in ways that newer pilots did not. But the Soviets and Chinese were learning too. Soviet regiments rotated through combat tours in Manchuria, giving more pilots combat experience. Chinese pilot training improved. By 1953, the average skill level of MiG pilots had increased significantly, and the kill ratios reflected it. One of the most significant developments was the use of aerial refueling to extend the range of Sabres. With drop tanks and aerial refueling, F-86 could spend more time in MiG Alley, could engage enemy fighters further north, and could provide better protection for strike aircraft. The Air Force also experimented with tactics to lure MiGs into traps. Lone fighters would fly provocatively near the Yalu, appearing vulnerable. When MiGs dove to attack, other Sabres would drop from higher altitude to ambush the ambushers. It didn't always work. The MiG pilots learned to be suspicious of easy targets, but when it did, the results could be devastating. Personal rivalries developed, though pilots rarely knew who they were. Fighting. American aces would recognize certain MiG formations or tactics and knew they were facing skilled opponents. Soviet aces, reviewing gun camera footage and intelligence reports, similarly recognized American pilots by their tactics. It was a strange, anonymous duel, men trying to kill each other at 40,000 feet, never seeing each other's faces, never knowing names, connected only by the gun sight and the brief moments of combat that might end in a victor and a dead man falling from the sky. By the summer of 1953, peace negotiations were finally bearing fruit. An armistice was imminent, but the fighting intensified. Both sides wanted to score victories before the war ended, to demonstrate strength at the negotiating table. In the final weeks, the air battles over MiG Alley reached a crescendo. MiGs came south in large formations, sometimes 50 or more aircraft, trying to overwhelm American defenses. The Sabre pilots met them with everything they had. On July 20th, 1953, just days before the armistice, there was one of the largest air battles of the war. Over 100 aircraft, MiGs and Sabres, tangled in a sprawling dogfight that ranged across the length of MiG Alley. Contrails crisscrossed the sky. Aircraft spun out in front of the sun, guns blazing. Pilots shouted warnings over the radio, called out targets, screamed for help when they were hit. When it was over, American pilots claimed 16 MiGs destroyed for the loss of one Sabre. It was never independently verified, but what mattered was that the Americans had held the line. The MiGs had not broken through to the vulnerable attack aircraft below. The last aerial victory of the Korean War occurred on July 27, 1953, the day the armistice was signed. An F-86 pilot shot down a MiG in the morning hours. By the end of the day, the shooting had stopped. The silence was eerie. For 3 years, the skies over Korea had been filled with the scream of jets, the rattle of machine gun fire, the thunder of explosions. Now, nothing. Pilots flew their last missions in strange quiet, knowing that the enemy was still up there, but under orders not to engage. When the Sabre pilots returned to base that final time, there were no celebrations, just exhaustion, relief, and the memory of friends who hadn't made it back. The air war over Korea changed military aviation forever. It was the first war where jet fighters fought jet fighters, the first war where supersonic speeds were routinely achieved in combat dives, the first war where electronic warfare and ground-controlled intercept played major roles. The lessons learned in MiG Alley shaped air combat doctrine for decades. The importance of pilot training, of superior tactics over superior numbers, of maintaining air superiority to protect ground forces, all were proven in the skies over North Korea. The F-86 Sabre became legendary. Pilots who flew it spoke of it with reverence, a beautiful, deadly machine that saved their lives and won the war in the air. The MiG-15 earned similar respect. It was a formidable opponent, and the pilots who flew it, Soviet, Chinese, North Korean, proved that courage and skill were not the exclusive property of any nation. 39 American pilots became aces in Korea, shooting down 5 or more enemy aircraft. Hundreds more flew combat missions, faced death daily, and came home with stories they rarely told. Some didn't come home at all. Their names are etched on memorials, their aircraft lost in the mountains or in the cold waters off Korea's coast. The Korean War air campaign also demonstrated the limits of air power. Despite thousands of sorties, despite near-total air superiority over South Korea, despite the destruction of countless targets, air power alone could not win the war. Ground forces still had to hold the line. The war ended in stalemate, with the border roughly where it had begun. But in the skies over MiG Alley, in that narrow corridor of airspace where the future of air combat was written, there was no stalemate. American pilots and their Sabres dominated, not through numbers or technology alone, but through training, discipline, and the kind of courage that sends men into the thin, cold air to face an enemy who wants nothing more than to kill them. The last of the Korean War fighter pilots are in their 90s now, or have passed on. The F-86 Sabres are museum pieces. The MiG-15s are relics. But the legacy of MiG Alley remains, a testament to the men who fought the first jet war, who learned to fight at speeds their fathers could never have imagined, and who proved that even in the age of machines, it is still the man inside who makes the difference. When you look up at contrails in the sky, remember that once those spiraling lines told stories of life and death, of men pushing themselves and their machines to the absolute limit, fighting in a war that has been largely forgotten, but whose lessons echo through every air campaign that followed. This was MiG Alley. This was the first jet war.